the ACT. Cool. So the ACT, even though the tests are pretty similar now in terms of how they're structured and content, is at 36 points. There's 4 sections on ACT: the English, mathematics, reading, science, and then a writing score. There's the optional essay. But the score that you get, your composite score, is your average of your English, mathematics, reading, and science section scores. There's sub-scores, just like we saw before. You'll see that the categories are a little bit different. You know, usage, mechanics, rhetorical skills. You'll see that the math is a little bit different. This is where you can see how the math and the ACT is a little bit easier, a little bit lower grade level than the math and the SAT. Comes across pretty clearly here. And then there's a reading score as well. And then they have what essentially their cross-test scores, right? So English, language arts, average of English reading and writing, and then your STEM, your average of math and science. They're trying to combine those things as well. Just like in the SAT, schools really care about what your composite score is and what you got in those 4 different sections. All the other stuff matters a lot less, right? So when you send your application to Harvard, they see, like, did you get a 35 on the ACT or did you not? And that's really what they care about. Again, just like the SAT, the structure is predictable. You know exactly what is going to be coming in. You're going to take an English section, then you're going to take a mathematics section. A little bit longer in the math, but you get to use the calculator. Quite a few questions on the ACT math, right? So students often have time pressure on that. Then the reading section, then the science section, and then again, an optional essay that's 40 minutes. If you'll see that the total time allotment for the ACT is a little bit less than the time allotment for the SAT, and there's more questions on that test. So you see where that time intensity comes in. One difference here as opposed to the SAT, 4 to 5 multiple choice options per question. But again, as the ACT has always been, there's no penalty for guessing. So again, you run out of time, fill in a bunch of answers, at least you have a shot at getting the right answer. Yeah?
So, sorry if you addressed this before, but when something is optional, if there's an optional section,
Yeah.
how exactly then does that change the weighting for the rest of the test? And do you decide it on the fly? Is it a separate administration? Like, how exactly does that all work?
Yeah, so essentially you take the sections, you get through the 4 sections, and they'll say, hey, you want to hang in here and take it or not, right? Like, students have the opportunity to leave, or they have the opportunity to take it. There'll be a break in between those 2 sections. In terms of what students should do, they should really know going in, should I take the writing or should I not, right? And the way to think about that is, 1, are you a good writer? How good's your grammar when you're not on when you have time pressure? How good's your spelling? How good are you under time pressure in terms of writing, right? And ultimately, like, do you think you can convey something that will help improve your college application or not? For lots of students, they're not great with that time pressure, especially when writing, and it's better for them to just say, hey, I'm not going to take it. But for some students, they are good with that. It gives them another opportunity to show college what they're capable of doing. That's the way you should think about all of this, right? So if you think you're going to do well in that, take it, but there's ways to figure that out before you get in. And most students will intuitively know, like, okay, am I going to be good at writing something in 40 minutes or not with that time pressure on me? The other thing to consider is test fatigue, right? So if you have a student who doesn't have great test endurance, this is the longest test they've taken, probably best for them not to do that, because even if they are a great writer with 40 minutes, they've taken a pretty long test, a pretty intense test before they get to that point. So it depends on the student, but know beforehand is pretty important.
Is there a penalty, whether stated or implicit, on the college side when students opt out? Is there a perception that
No,
they opt out?
there's no penalty. The college counselors are using the SAT and ACT primarily for that 1600 or that 56, and a lot less for the writing. You get a lot of writing chances when you apply to college, right? And your Common App and the specific essays for the university, so they get to see you write plenty, but it is another opportunity. So it just depends on the student.
Is your guess that, like, not to put you on the spot, Mike,
Yeah.
is your guess, I'm just gonna keep doing it anyway.
Yeah.
Is your guess that, like, if the world worked perfectly, something like 10-20% of students would do the optional essay?
Yeah,
Or
probably a
more?
quarter,
A
something
quarter,
like that.
yeah.
Yeah, probably a quarter would, and 3/4 would opt out and put their writing samples through their application.
Yep.
That's right.
So the essay is always optional in ACT?
And SAT now, they're optional on both.
Oh,
would you say it's better for someone who thinks they're a bad test taker? So in other words, is kind of thinking, I'm not going to do that well, but I'm a great writer, so I should definitely do the essay. Is that typically what you see?
No, because like, people who are bad test takers are, there's a whole slew of why people are bad test takers. But I often find that people who are generally high achieving, who are bad at test taking or assume they're bad at test taking, is because of the time pressure and how anxiety riddled they make themselves. And that's not necessarily better on multiple choice questions versus writing, right? I've rarely seen where someone's terrible at multiple choice because they're too anxiety riddled and they're awesome at writing. Those things tend to go hand in hand, right? Cool. So ultimately, like, when we talk about the SAT versus ATT, it's an individual choice, right? Which test you take. It should be a little bit about what best fits you. I listed the major differences on that earlier slide. That tells you a lot. So if you're great at mathematics, you might want to take the SAT, right? If you don't handle time pressure very well, you might want to take the SAT. But it's that holistic, how do you handle these different factors and the differences between the tests that you need to consider. And ultimately, what I recommend everyone does is take an SAT diagnostic and take an ACT diagnostic, right? See roughly where you score, see roughly what your percentiles are, and determine, is that delta big enough, and what you know about yourself and your student, is that delta big enough to make a choice of take one versus the other. We help people with that all the time. It's pretty straightforward how you do it, but you got to put a bit of work in the front end to figure out which one you should take. Once you've decided, hey, I'm going to take the SAT, I'm going to focus on it, here are the reasons why I'm going to take the SAT, or here are the reasons I'm going to take the ACT, I'm going to focus on that, then put a plan together and focus on the SAT or the ACT. Students don't need to take both. And like I said, earlier we talked about it, I don't recommend that people take both. In very rare instances, they'll say, yeah, like that makes sense, you should go and take the ACT, you've plateaued in the SAT, whatever it happens to be. And we'll generally know, right? Because students, whenever we work with people, or you guys doing it on your own, take a diagnostic, put together a study plan, have diagnostics as you go along that study plan, and at some point, there's nothing else you can do. You're at your terminal score.
Yeah, so basically, like, if you take your diagnostics, and this is assuming to some degree that you give yourself enough time, right? There are time-related decisions, those are more case by case, but if you give yourself enough time, you take your two diagnostics, and if they're not obvious, right, like if they're close, then you fall back on, I think, two things. One, was there a higher level of comfort with one of the two? Like every question, regardless of the outcome, you just felt much more comfortable taking that test. Two, were these characteristics, where your natural strengths and your natural weaknesses lie. And then you do it in a way where the worst case scenario is you plateau quickly, which may not mean that the other one's right for you. It may just mean that's your max score, period. But you plateau quickly and you have left yourself enough time to experiment and see if you go up the curve faster on the other test, which you'll know with some level of speed.
Yeah.
You'll take 4 or 5 tests and you'll go up much faster, or you won't.
That's right. Yeah.
Is there a published equivalent, like a 1400 on the SATs, is a
Yes.
34 on the?
There is. So one caveat is we have very little data on the new SAT, right? So some of that is being sussed out right now. But there is an equivalency chart that you can look up and see, okay, this is roughly what I would do on one versus the other.
And our percent, should we think like percentiles equal percentiles? Or is
Yeah,
that
percentiles equal percentiles is roughly right. That's roughly right. So if you're 92 on one and 89 the other, that 92 is probabilistically better.
Percentile.
Yeah, exactly. So that's it on the SAT and the ACT in terms of those two tests. And then a little disappointing news for students is, depending on what types of colleges you're applying to, you have to take some SAT 2 subject tests, right? So the handful of top universities in the country will essentially require you to do this, right? And they're going to want to see proficiency across these. The nice thing is you get to choose which ones you take. So there's ones in math, science, English, history, and languages. The reason that this is done is for your very top universities, whether it's Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, whatever it happens to be. Just at Harvard and Yale, for last year's entering class, the median SAT score was a 1600. So it's a perfect score. So you get a perfect score, you apply to Yale, and they're like, okay, there's 5,000 other people who apply just like you. So what differentiates you? And one of the things that students are able to differentiate themselves on are subject exams. So the average student should take 3 to 4 of these if they're applying to school like that. You'll see some really aggressive students take 8, right, and get 800s across the board.